This week on Perspective, South Africa, old challenges, new beginnings. Nearly a quarter of a century after the election of Nelson Mandela and the ANC, South Africa is still talking about new beginnings and invoking the hopes and aspirations of the past, of Mandela, or Madiba, as he's often called.
We should honor Madiba by putting behind us the era of discord, the era of disunity, and the era of disillusionment that had somehow engulfed our country. We should put behind us the era of diminishing trust in public institutions and weakened confidence in our country's public leaders. We should put all the negativity that has dogged our country behind us, because a new dawn is upon us.
Just over a month ago, Cyril Ramaphosa became South Africa's 5th post-apartheid president after 8 years of the controversial, contentious, and allegedly corrupt leadership of Jacob Zuma. Just this week, corruption charges were reinstated against Zuma related to a multi-billion-dollar arms deal. Ramaphosa promises to take on corruption, restore integrity, and at the same time take on the challenge of economic inequality in South Africa, a condition that has worsened since the end of apartheid. One way of doing that is through land reform. It's a historically significant and potentially explosive political issue. We'll hear more about it on the program today. We'll also get a close-up look at the water crisis in Cape Town, South Africa, the first major city in the modern world to face the very real threat of running out of fresh water. The CBC's Margaret Evans has just returned from Cape Town, and she'll give us her perspective. But we begin on the ground in Johannesburg with a political perspective from Lynsey Chutel, a journalist with Quartz. President Ramaphosa is new to his job, but he is pretty well known to most South Africans. He's a few weeks in now. How do South Africans see his first steps?
Well, it's been interesting. I think how we've been, one of the easiest ways to monitor it is via South Africa's currency, the rand. And immediately, even before he became president, when he became president of the African National Congress in December, the rand suddenly strengthened to a level that we haven't seen since former President Jacob Zuma fired the finance minister. So there was a lot of welcoming, both from South Africans who had grown very wary of scandals with former President Jacob Zuma. And so, there's been a lot of positivity, especially because he's seen as an astute businessman, an astute negotiator. He's come in on the ticket that he is going to get rid of corruption. And we've also seen really quick movements. For example, people who were implicated in those scandals, corruption scandals under President Jacob Zuma, are now slowly but surely beginning to face some sort of retribution. But the difficult part, I suppose, would be the latest move on land reform. That's scared a number of people, but also some parts of the country have really welcomed that move. So Ramaphosa, who was seen as a very reconciliatory character, is now people are a little bit more unsure about where exactly he stands. But I think he's still the guy who's going to try and walk the middle ground here.
Do you think he has the political smarts to be able to do that, to walk that middle ground when he's, been associated with the ANC for so long?
It's interesting because initially he's seen as this negotiator. That's his reputation in South Africa, coming out of the post-1994 constitutional negotiations, and helped write the constitution that we have today. So everyone sees him as this great negotiator and this great businessman. And yet there have been, how shall we put this? There were the manner in which he's chosen to do things, particularly when it came to President Zuma, where he kept saying that we were going to treat President Jacob Zuma with honor and respect. And South Africans wanted to see real quick responses. Perhaps President Jacob Zuma's former allies, the Gupta family, being walked out of their home. But what you've seen is a guy who seems to be wanting to doing things by the book. He's enforced the rules, he's sticking to the rules, and that may not make for the most passionate campaign rhetoric, and it may not make for great headlines, but what he seems to be doing is really ticking the boxes. And so in that sense, I think he'll definitely be that guy. But at the same time, he's at the helm of a party that South Africans are slowly but surely beginning to grow increasingly cynical of. Under the Zuma years, people who were loyal ANC supporters began to really question the direction of the party, wondering whose African National Congress is this? Is this really the party of Nelson Mandela, the party that really held the moral high ground under the Mandela years and the Mbeki years afterwards, where now they had seemed to be embroiled in corruption scandals to the point where they were barely able to actually lead the country and govern the country. And so he's got to deal with that reputation at the same time. So he has, ahead of the election, he's got quite some work to do.
You've also written that South Africans need to reclaim their democracy in this Ramaphosa era. What are you driving at?
So South Africa's political system is interesting in that we follow a system in which you elect the party, and the party in turn elects the president in parliament. It's why Ramaphosa was able to come in without a national election, and that's all legal and it's fine and it's constitutional. But I think that the problem with that is that it leaves South African citizens with the sense of powerlessness, where you feel like you're watching your political destiny unfold and you have no part to play in it because so much power is held within the African National Congress. But I do think that ever since 1994, and even now we've seen with the various Fees Must Fall movement among students, we've seen constant protests in South Africa, and that's a good thing because it shows that South Africans are really involved in their democracy, involved in the democratic process. So there are people who want to be heard. And so what I think needs to happen is South Africans need to find a way where we are ensuring that the African National Congress, short of changing the entire electoral system, that the party is aware that it is accountable to South Africans, not only accountable to branch members in the African National Congress. And that's the tricky part, where a few hundred people get to decide for the rest of the country.
Who's the opposition? I know the country's looking at an election in a year or so. Who is the opposition?
That's the tricky part. So our opposition, we have a main opposition, the Democratic Alliance, and they've really set themselves as the party who believe in the Rainbow Nation principles, a party of multiracial ethics. But what they are being seen as is a party that still very much protects the interests of a minority of white South Africans who remain the most advantaged in South Africa, the most economically advantaged. And so the Democratic Alliance, even though they now have a black president for the first time in their history, their liberal progressive values are being questioned as, are they really liberal and progressive? And if so, why is it that the party still seems to be backing wealthy white South Africans? And then on the other spectrum, you have the more radical, far-left economic freedom fighters. They're led by Julius Malema, who was the youth leader kicked out of the African National Congress. And he was always a very charismatic and very smart politician. And what he's been able to do is to really rally young South Africans. South Africa has a youthful population, but of our young people, half of them are unemployed. So what you have is that you have people under the age of 25 who are increasingly frustrated. Those who happen to find a place in our limited university spaces, they're struggling to pay fees. They can't pay their tuition. So he's really worked on that youthful anger in South Africa, coming with those particularly radical principles that appeal to a younger electorate.
So I know it's some time out now, but then as you look at that next election campaign, what is the issue that campaign will turn on, do you think?
So the issue that's at the top of mind for most South Africans right now is the issue of land reform. But part of the African National Congress's vote in December last year, as they decided their policies for the next couple of years, was that land would be expropriated without compensation. And what that means is that large tracts of South Africa's agricultural, commercial farming is still owned by white South Africans, and much of it, actually, the majority is owned by the state. And the argument is that because South Africa has a history of having black South Africans removed from the land and forced into segregated townships, the plan is that now, more than a century later, that the land should be slowly returned to black South Africans. But the question is about how that's going to happen, and that's the divisive issue. Especially because our neighbor Zimbabwe tried it about more than a decade ago, and we know how that went in Zimbabwe. And so South Africa the African National Congress has to walk this fine line of saying we will give back the land to black people who are still seeking justice after so long. But then you have the Democratic Alliance who's saying that we will not allow for land to be given out without compensation. So it's a very complex issue, but at the same time, it's such an emotional issue that the complexities are forgotten.
And isn't there the potential for violence too?
That's the concern. I think the thing that I must say that I find disturbing is this continuous there seems to be a rhetoric that there is a genocide happening in South Africa, which is a little bit shocking, to be quite honest, because I live here, and while we do have high rates of crime, there's certainly no war, no genocide happening. And what we've seen is that because white farmers have felt that they are being targeted by crime, they're saying that it's not just crime that affects the way it affects the rest of the country. That is the beginnings of a genocide. Now, there are many people who are saying, and white South Africans included, who are saying that it's not a genocide, but there's really these few but very loud voices in what we would call the alt-right, who are really using those statistics that have been repurposed in some way to force violence, and that's concerning, because you've got both sides, the radicals saying that we will fight for our land, radical black South Africans, and then conservative alt-right, almost white South Africans saying that we will defend ourselves. And so these tiny pockets of violence are really eroding any rational conversation that might happen.
Lynsey, thank you very much for your insight on all of this.
Thanks for having me.